So when I was growing up, I wanted to be a missionary. When my evangelical Christian Midwestern junior high youth group took a trip to London, I went along as a mime. Yes, a mime, actually a mime for Jesus. So that was, and then I also was a balloon animal maker. And these things I found to be incredibly effective ways to change the hearts and minds of those under the age of maybe like 6, approximately 6. But for everybody over the age of 6, we had to go to the mall. So we were usually sent off in pairs at the mall and sent to talk to people with a device. So a very popular device that we often got was a survey. And the survey looked a lot like a school project. So we would literally just go up to people and we'd say, excuse me, so I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions. Great, okay, so do you believe in God? Oh, okay, interesting. And why or why not? Yes. And then once we had them engaged and we had this going, we would dive in with a Bible verse and tell them why their answer was wrong. They had been punked, Jesus style. And then afterward, we would get together and we'd sit around in the food court and we'd sit in a circle and we'd go around in turn and we would tell one another how many people we had each converted to Christ that day, like over Cinnabon. And when it was my turn, I lied. All right, here's why. Well, first, here's what I did. I did choose a number that was somewhere in the mid to high range. I was aware that that was a very good place to be. So I chose a number in the mid to high range of those being reported. But in actuality, my numbers were significantly higher than everyone else's. All right, so you want to know why? Mm-hmm. Yes. All right, here's my secret. I did not use the surveys after one time. I did use it once. And I tried not to go in a pair. I often asked if I could go alone, and then I looked for other people who were sitting alone, who were sitting at a bench, or who were sitting in the food court, and I sat down next to them and I asked them to tell me about themselves. It's amazing what happens when you actually sit down and genuinely ask somebody who they are and then just shut up. So in those years in junior high that I spent wandering around the mall and talking to strangers, I learned a number of things. One thing that I learned is that our pain lives much closer to the surface than any of us are necessarily aware of. I learned that people are willing to tell you their deepest and their darkest secrets. They're willing to tell them to a stranger, to a weird little girl who approaches them in the mall, so for no other reason than the fact that she's listening. Usually I would ask people to pray with me afterward, but not always. Sometimes I went to the bathroom and cried afterward. And when it was time to sit around in the circle and talked about how many people we had converted to Christ that day, I lied because I didn't know how to talk about that experience with my peers, which seemed to be so very different than the experience that they had. I was coming back to the group, I was exhausted, I was confused, I was questioning my faith, and they kind of seemed okay. I remember watching then at the end of the sort of circle, then people would have their Taco Bell wrappers and their Cinnabon boxes on their tray, and on their tray next to it would be all of these completed surveys that would just get. The thing is, they didn't have to be kept because the answers that people gave didn't necessarily matter. I mean, so this was not a real survey, so that's a secret that now you know, if anyone ever approaches you. But B, this wasn't about a real conversation in which other people's opinions mattered as much as our opinions mattered. This wasn't even about the questions. This was about the answers, the right answers that only we had. So in high school, all of my youth group friends and we were all applying to Bible school. A lot of the girls were going for what we called their MRS, which means that they were looking for a good Christian husband. Ideally, they were looking for a pastor, because then you get to be a pastor's wife, and who doesn't want to do that? Well, so some people didn't want to do that. Actually, the ones who didn't really fit in very well, but who still wanted to give their lives to Christ, oftentimes were going to Bible school to become missionaries, and then you got to go to an exotic place, and you got to lead, I know, it's crazy, without a man. Maybe. It depended. But it was possible. So this was my plan, and I was off to Bible school. I applied early decision, and I then went abroad my senior year of high school in Australia. I was just going to see what it was like to live abroad and begin my life. So when I went to Australia, I was separated from my evangelical community for the first time for 6 whole months. And in this time, I remember searching for God without the constructs of evangelical Christianity that it had been housed in, that he or she had been housed in before. And I remember actually finding God to be kind of easy to find. So, I would take these long walks at night, almost every single night, alongside the ocean near my host family's house. And I would be in prayer on these long walks. And God was always there in the sand and in the ocean and in everywhere. And I began to wonder if these two things that I had always been taught were synonymous, God and evangelical Christianity, were in fact not. So I went back home 2 weeks before I was to start Bible school. And I sat down with my parents and I said to them, so a couple of things. One, I still love God. So just have that in your mind. And two, I don't think that I love his church enough to be its spokesperson. So the next morning I called the Bible school and told them I would not be coming after all. In the next few months, I was paging through brochures for secular colleges for the first time. We were talking about this last night. Do you remember that we actually used to have brochures? This was like a thing that I don't understand. I think like 3 years ago they just... But anyway, so I was paging through these brochures, and I fell in love with one school in particular that talked about wanting to teach people how to think and not what to think. So this was a place of questions, not a place of answers. And I was so taken by that idea, that it was the only school I applied to. This was a place where you actually did not even know what your grades were on your test or on your paper until the class was long over. So you didn't even know if you were right? Until it didn't even matter if you were right. So I was in love. And so I came, and it was in New York City, not New York City actually, right outside New York City. You guys can guess if you want. Far, far from my Midwestern hometown, far enough that I was not aware of a few things about it. So here's one. It was certainly one of the most liberal colleges in the nation, but specifically one of the most sexually liberal colleges in the nation. So this was news for me. So I remember my second week of college being introduced to something that was called Sleaze Week. So this was a week of school-sponsored education and celebration of sex work. Yes, so we would have, obviously we had certain things like a coming out dance, but we also had sadomasochism dances, and then we also had a sex worker come in and lead a workshop in which people were invited to stand in a line and put on a plastic glove and one by one come up and insert a finger into her vagina while she rhythmically clenched and released her vaginal muscles, demonstrating an orgasm, and they found their way to her G-spot. Oh my God! But the other thing is that at the same time as this seemed totally insane to me, I was also kind of in love with the way that students were. I mean, they just walked away around and they were completely unburdened by all of this sexual shame and by all of these gender restrictions that I had grown up with. And the women in particular, they walked around with this confidence and they spoke with authority. And the craziest part was that they were actually praised for it, not chided, not told to sit down like my friends and I had been. So over time, I would slowly, somewhat timidly, try to emulate my new peers' confidence in smaller ways. So just, not so much with the finger, but other things. Like, for instance, I decided that I was just going to make out with my boyfriend. I was just going to do it. At the end of the day, I was just going to do it, and I announced it to him, and I was like, this is happening, so be aware. And I suspect, will be good, so be ready. And then when I tried, I was slapped back by something inside of me that I hadn't even known was there. But I decided, no, I'm pushing through. We're going to keep on. This is the goal. And this goal, and I'm lowering my vocal register to a real vocal register when I realized I was speaking in a higher vocal register that was natural to me. All these different things. I said, no, I'm just going to push through. I'm going to do this. And then I started to have these nightmares. And I started to have paranoia, and I was taking birth control pills even though I wasn't having sex. And then I was taking pregnancy tests because the fear that somehow the sperm, I would just sneak around the underwear, and then just, while I wasn't looking, something, and I mean, I was smart and I understood that I was not going to be pregnant, but at the same time, taking these tests was the only way that I could actually steady my breathing enough to get through another day of trying to be a strong, powerful woman when I had been raised to be a little girl. And over the years, the anxiety only got worse. And at the age of 26, it had gotten so bad that I actually got into my car and drove across the country to what now felt like the belly of the beast to me. I went to my hometown. And I sat down at my parents' kitchen table and I spread out in front of me 10 years of church directories. And one by one, I called every young woman in her 20s who had been raised in my church and asked her to get together with me. Because I had to know if I was the only one. And I spent that entire year in coffee shops and living rooms and bars, talking to people about their stories, dozens of women's stories from my church. In some ways, I felt a little like I was in the mall again, collecting these stories and having this pain surface. So one young woman told me that she had been married several years and was still having a panic attack 75% of the time that she tried to have sex with her husband. Another woman told me about being on dates with her fiance and looking in the rearview mirror because she was afraid that somebody was following them to make sure that they weren't engaging in sexual activity early, even though she thought that sounded kind of crazy, and actually they had never even kissed. She's 27, by the way. Another young woman talked about in the first year of her marriage being so afraid that she was going to have sex wrong and that everybody would find out that the whole time she'd been a secretly internal whore of some kind, that she was checking her Kleenex boxes and checking her picture frames for recording devices. So I went on to do 2 more years of interviews. I found too much. I went on to do 2 more years of interviews in New York City with evangelical and ex-evangelical women. And over again, I would hear people say to me, so I've never told anyone this story before, and do you think it makes me crazy? And over time, I was able to say to them, well, you are the 3rd person, or the 4th, or the 5th, who's told me a story like this, so apparently where we come from, it doesn't make you crazy. Apparently, where we come from, it makes you normal. These things should not be normal. Paranoia, a fear of intimacy, depression, masochism, self-hatred. I then went on to study in graduate school American evangelical messaging for girls in terms of sex and gender. And over the course of these research that I had done through interviews and through this research I had done in school, I pieced together a devastating pattern, which was that evangelical Christianity's sanctified sexual fear and gender-based oppression was creating a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder among today's young women. So here's the thing. Not every single woman I talk to experienced these things. More or less, I'd say 2/3. But the difference between those who did experience them and those who didn't was not what you might initially suppose. It wasn't whether they stayed in the church or left. It wasn't whether they got married or stayed single. What separated those who were traumatized from those who didn't report trauma was questioning. Those who seemed like they were doing well also seemed relatively comfortable within a system of answers. This is right, and this is wrong, and this is his way, and this is your way. And those who did report these things were question askers. So questions don't work so well within the evangelical framework, or quite frankly, within many of today's religious frameworks. So people swallowed those questions instead. They gulped them down, we gulped them down, and they festered inside of us and they turned into this post-traumatic stress disorder. But today, I am here as a witness again, to tell you that there is another way. So I spent the last several years working with some of the world's most profound progressive religious leaders. And over the course of this work, I've come to believe that anybody who thinks that they have come to an absolute answer on, let's say, anything, that means one thing. They need to ask better questions. I've come to see faith as an ongoing engagement with the unknown, with the unknowable, and to see then someone living their faith as a process of needing to live these questions and going ever deeper and going ever wider into the wondrous mystery that is this life. It's time, I believe, for us to break the cycle of silence, for us to bridge these separations that we have envisioned exist between us, one question at a time. In churches and in mosques and in synagogues and in malls. And with animal balloons and maybe orgasm workshops, potentially. But the point is, it's time for us to do it together, and with ourselves, and with the great unknowable unknown that gives us our breath. Thank you.